Before you listen any further, I want you to slow your breathing for just a moment, because what you are about to hear is not designed to scare you, impress you, or entertain you. It is designed to awaken a part of you that has been quietly numbed for years without your permission. Most people believe spiritual attacks announce themselves with chaos, temptation, or obvious darkness. That belief alone has kept millions blind. The most effective operation I was ever involved in did not look evil, did not feel threatening, and did not require force. They felt convenient. They felt helpful. They felt modern. They felt harmless. And because of that, they worked. You see, the Dark Kingdom does not waste resources on people who are obviously lost. It studies the devoted. It maps the disciplined. It analyzes those who pray, those who fast, those who believe they are alert. And when it finds patterns, it does not rush in with demons and nightmares. It simply introduces noise where silence once lived. It induces measurement where surrender once existed. It introduces awareness of self where awareness of God once ruled. And the tragedy is this: most believers never notice the moment it begins, because nothing is taken away. Everything is added. Added tools, added data, added structure, added reassurance, added convenience. And slowly, imperceptibly, something sacred is crowded out. I know how unsettling this sounds, because I once relied on the fact that it would. Confusion buys time. Dismissal buys safety. Laughter buys denial. And while people are debating whether something is that deep, the war continues uninterrupted. The truth is, the Dark Kingdom has always understood something that many Christians have forgotten. Attention is the gate, not belief, not morality. Attention. Where attention flows, influence follows. Where influence settles, formation occurs. And where formation is altered long enough, identity begins to shift without resistance. This is why the most dangerous moment in a believer as day is not temptation, but distraction dressed as discipline. It is not sin that worries the enemy most, but fragmentation. A divided focus weakens prayer far more effectively than doubt ever could. And this is where many of you are standing right now, even if you dawn to realize it yet. I want you to consider something carefully. When was the last time you prayed without monitoring time, posture, breath, heart rate, progress, or outcome? When was the last time you entered prayer without carrying an awareness of yourself that competed with your awareness of God? When was the last time stillness felt uncomfortable instead of natural? These questions are not accusations. They are diagnostics. And they reveal more than most sermons ever will. The Dark Kingdom never planned to stop prayer. That idea is childish. Prayer cannot be stopped. What can be altered is depth. What can be interrupted is flow. What can be diluted is presence. And the moment prayer becomes something you do while managing something else, something sacred has already shifted. There was a time when prayer was the one place where metrics failed. No data, no feedback, no external validation, just obedience, surrender, and trust. That made it dangerous. So the strategy changed. Not to eliminate prayer, but to modernize the believer's relationship with it, to make self-awareness constant, to make internal silence feel unproductive, to make stillness feel like wasted potential, to make uninterrupted moments feel irresponsible. And once that conditioning took hold, the work became effortless, because people began policing themselves, they began interrupting themselves, they began fragmenting their own attention long before any external force needed to intervene. Most Christians assume attacks feel like oppression. In reality, the most successful attacks feel like improvement. They feel like optimization. They feel like progress. They feel like stewardship. And that is why you were never warned properly. Because nothing about this feels like darkness. It feels like advancement. It feels like being informed. It feels like being in control. And control, when subtly introduced into sacred spaces, always replaces trust before it replaces faith. Trust erodes quietly. Faith collapses later. I am speaking to you now because something has accelerated. The shift is subtle but unmistakable to those who recognize patterns. The pace of life has increased, but that is not the danger. The danger is that believers are being trained to carry noise into every moment that once required silence. And when silence disappears, discernment soon follows. You cannot discern clearly when your attention is constantly split. You cannot listen deeply when you are always monitoring. You cannot surrender fully when you are always measuring. And yet, this has become normal, expected, even celebrated. I want you to understand something very clearly before you dismiss this as exaggeration. The Dark Kingdom does not need you to abandon God. It only needs you to never fully arrive in His presence. Half attention is enough. Partial stillness is enough. Interrupted prayer is enough. A distracted believer is predictable. A fragmented believer is manageable. A believer who cannot sit quietly without stimulation is already compromised, even if they worship faithfully and speak the right language. This is not about gadgets, devices, or objects. Those are symbols. The real battlefield is posture. The posture of the heart. The posture of attention. The posture of surrender. You are about to hear things in this conversation that many will mock, not because they are false, but because they threaten comfort. Comfort is one of the dark kingdom, as most effective anesthetics. Comfortable Christians rarely ask dangerous questions. Comfortable Christians rarely guard silence. Comfortable Christians rarely notice when something sacred has been slowly crowded out. And by the time they do, they assume the problem is fatigue, burnout, or age, never realizing that their spiritual nervous system has been trained into constant alertness, never rest. I am not here to condemn technology, habits, or modern life. That would be foolish. The dark kingdom never relies on absolutes. It relies on imbalance. It relies on excess. It relies on substitution. And the most effective substitutions are the ones that look almost identical to the original, just slightly altered. Just enough to change the outcome without changing the appearance. That is why this conversation matters now, not later, now. Because once you see a pattern, it loses power. Awareness disrupts systems that rely on automation. And there's nothing the dark kingdom fears more than a believer who becomes conscious of where their attention truly lives. If you feel a quiet discomfort as you listen, that is not fear. That is recognition. And recognition is always the first step toward reclaiming ground that was never meant to be surrendered. Stay with me. What you are about to understand will change how you approach prayer, stillness, and presence in ways most people will never articulate, but you will feel immediately. And once you feel it, you will never unknow it. There is a reason I am careful with how much I reveal and how I reveal it, because authority is not established by dramatic confession, but by consistency, restraint, and accuracy. Anyone can invent stories about darkness. Very few understand how it actually functions. The dark kingdom does not operate on chaos the way people imagine. It operates on structure, hierarchy, research, testing, iteration, and long-term observation. I was not recruited because I was wild or reckless. I was recruited because I was disciplined, analytical, and precise. Those are the traits that matter most in influence operations. Emotional people are unpredictable. Disciplined people are useful. And for many years I was useful. My role was not to tempt people into obvious sin. That work is inefficient and produces unstable outcomes. My responsibility was to help design systems that influence behavior quietly, over time, without triggering resistance. Systems that allowed people to believe they were choosing freely while their range of choices was slowly narrowed. Systems that did not attack faith directly but reshaped the environment around it until faith adapted without realizing it had changed. I oversaw teams that studied patterns, not individuals but categories. We did care about names. We cared about habits, rhythms, routines, emotional cycles, attention spans. We analyzed when people were most focused, when they were most distracted, when they felt spiritually strong, when they felt spiritually weak. Prayer habits were especially valuable, not because we could stop them, but because they revealed discipline. Disciplined people are dangerous. They are resilient. They are hard to manipulate emotionally. So instead of breaking their discipline, we learned how to reroute it. We did to remove prayer from their lives. We reshaped how it was experienced. We learned how to introduce layers of self-awareness that subtly competed with surrender. We learned how to make people feel productive while quietly diminishing depth. And the more sincere the believer, the more effective the strategy became, because sincerity without awareness is easily guided. One of the earliest operations I was involved in focused on interruption tolerance. We tested how often a person could be interrupted during a sacred activity before the quality of engagement permanently declined. The results were consistent. A small number of interruptions did not weaken commitment, but frequent micro-interruptions trained the mind to expect disruption. Over time, stillness began to feel unsafe, silence began to feel empty, unbroken focus began to feel unnatural. And once that threshold was crossed, the person would begin interrupting themselves even when nothing external occurred. That was the breakthrough. Once self-interruption became habitual, external interference was no longer required. The system sustained itself. Another assignment involved studying measurement and motivation. Humans are deeply responsive to feedback. When you measure something, you shape how it is valued. When you track something, you change how it is approached. When you quantify something, you redefine success. This is harmless in many areas of life. But when applied to spiritual disciplines, it creates a subtle shift. Prayer becomes something you perform rather than something you enter. Presence becomes something you manage rather than something you receive. Over time, believers begin evaluating prayer based on how it felt, how long it lasted, how consistent it was, rather than whether it produced surrender. That shift alone was enough to weaken discernment without anyone realizing what had happened. I remember a specific review session where we discussed believers who had strong theology, strong morals, strong church involvement, yet consistently lacked clarity. They were confused, tired, spiritually dry, but could not identify why. They assumed burnout. They assumed seasons. They assumed God was silent. None of that was true. What had changed was their interior environment. Their attention had become fragmented. Their inner stillness had been replaced with constant monitoring. Their awareness had turned inward in subtle ways that crowded out listening. And because nothing had been taken away, they never suspected influence. That was considered a success. It is important for you to understand that the Dark Kingdom does not hate discipline. It exploits it. It does not fear structure. It studies it. It does not oppose routines. It infiltrates them. Anything repeated becomes predictable. Anything predictable can be redirected. And once redirected long enough, it becomes normalized. Many of the believers we studied were highly committed, deeply sincere, and morally upright. That did not protect them. In some cases, it made them easier to influence because they trusted their own intentions. They assumed sincerity equaled safety. That assumption was rarely questioned. There were missions where my only task was observation, no intervention, just watching how people responded to constant low-level stimulation, notifications, alerts, metrics, gentle reminders. Over time, their baseline attention fractured. They struggled to remain present in any single moment without feeling the urge to check, adjust, measure, or respond. Even in prayer, their minds remained partially elsewhere, not in sin, not in rebellion, just split. And a split mind cannot fully listen. A divided heart cannot fully rest. This was never framed as evil internally. It was framed as efficiency, as modernization, as adaptation to a faster world. And that framing is why it works so well. You might be wondering why someone like me would step away from this. The answer is not dramatic. It was not fear. It was clarity. I noticed something that was not part of any report or analysis. The more we succeeded, the more hollow the outcomes became. We were not producing corrupted believers. We were producing exhausted ones, confused ones, anxious ones, people who loved God but felt distant without understanding why. And that distance did not draw them toward darkness. It drained them of strength. And a drained believer is less dangerous than a rebellious one. That realization unsettled me more than any theology ever could. There was a moment, quiet and unremarkable, when I realized that the systems we designed could not touch something essential. No matter how refined the strategy, no matter how subtle the influence, there remained a threshold we could not cross. When a believer entered true stillness, uninterrupted, unmeasured, unobserved, the system failed. Patterns broke. Predictability vanished. Influence weakened. That bothered me deeply because it exposed a limitation. Any system with a limitation invites scrutiny. I am telling you this not to elevate myself, but to establish something important. I am not guessing. I am not speculating. I am not reacting emotionally. I am describing patterns I help refine. And I am also telling you that these patterns are fragile once they are exposed. They rely on unconscious participation. The moment awareness enters, the system loses leverage. That is why conversations like this are discouraged, mocked, or dismissed as paranoia, not because they are dangerous, but because they disrupt automation. If I were still operating from my former position and listening to this message, I would be concerned. Not because it reveals secrets, but because it sharpens discernment. Discernment cannot be measured, tracked, or optimized. It emerges from stillness. And stillness cannot coexist with constant noise. That is why silence has always been targeted, not through prohibition, but through replacement. Replace silence with stimulation. Replace stillness with productivity. Replace surrender with management. And the work completes itself. As someone who once designed these strategies, I can tell you this with certainty. Nothing terrifies the Dark Kingdom more than a believer who becomes conscious of their attention. Not emotional outrage, not public protest, not online arguments, conscious attention. A person who chooses when to disconnect. A person who can sit without stimulation. A person who can pray without monitoring. A person who does not confuse awareness of self with awareness of God. That kind of believer is unpredictable. And unpredictability collapses systems built on patterns. I am speaking now because the window for unconscious participation is narrowing. People are beginning to feel the cost even if they cannot yet name it. They feel spiritually tired without being sinful. They feel distant without being disobedient. They feel distracted without knowing why. That discomfort is not failure. It is signal. And once you recognize it as such, you regain ground that was quietly conceded over years. Stay with me. What comes next will make sense of experiences you may have struggled to explain, and it will give language to something you have felt but never fully understood. What I am about to explain now is the part most people misunderstand, because they assume the strategy is about objects, devices, or tools, when in reality those are only surfaces. The real work happens beneath awareness, at the level of habit formation and internal posture. The Dark Kingdom does not need to convince you of anything new. It only needs to slowly reshape how you experience what you already believe. Faith does not disappear overnight. It adapts. Prayer does not stop. It thins. Devotion does not collapse. it fragments. And fragmentation is the silent engine behind almost everything you are feeling but cannot fully articulate. When attention is divided often enough, the soul learns to live in a constant state of partial presence. You are always somewhere, but never fully there. That state feels normal because it becomes familiar. Familiarity is one of the most powerful anesthetics known to the human mind. The strategy begins with redefining what it means to be engaged. Engagement used to mean immersion. Now it means interaction. Interaction creates feedback. Feedback creates awareness of self. Awareness of self crowds out awareness of God when both compete for the same internal space. This is not philosophical. It is neurological. The human mind cannot fully attend to two centers at once. It prioritizes whichever stimulus is most immediate, most measurable, most responsive. Silence offers none of those things. Silence requires trust. And trust is expensive in a culture trained to demand constant confirmation. So the environment is shaped to make silence feel unproductive, even irresponsible. The believer begins to feel subtle anxiety when nothing is happening. That anxiety is not sinful. It is conditioned. One of the most effective shifts was reframing discipline as management. Instead of entering prayer, people began scheduling it. Instead of surrendering time, they allocated it. Instead of waiting, they tracked. None of this feels wrong on the surface. In fact, it feels wise, responsible, mature, but over time, the internal posture changes. Prayer becomes an activity you oversee rather than a space you inhabit. When that happens, you remain partially in control, and partial control always limits surrender. This is why many believers feel like they are doing everything right and still feel distant. The issue is not effort. It is posture. Another key component of the strategy is constant low-level stimulation. Not overwhelming noise, just enough to prevent deep settling. Notifications, reminders, alerts, vibrations, visual cues. Individually, they seem insignificant. Collectively, they retrain the nervous system. The body learns to expect interruption. The mind learns to scan for updates. Even in quiet moments, there's an underlying readiness to respond. That readiness prevents true rest. You may sit still, but internally you remain alert. That state feels like attentiveness, but it is actually vigilance. Vigilance is incompatible with surrender. You cannot fully release control while staying on guard. And yet, many believers now carry vigilance into prayer without realizing it. The brilliance of this approach is that it requires no coercion. People willingly participate because it feels helpful. It promises insight. It promises self-knowledge. It promises improvement. Humans are naturally drawn to anything that offers clarity about themselves. But when self-knowledge becomes constant, it turns inward. The gaze that was meant to lift upward slowly curves back toward the self, not in pride, but in preoccupation. The believer becomes deeply aware of their state, their performance, their consistency, their feelings. That awareness consumes mental bandwidth. Prayer becomes something happening alongside self-monitoring rather than beyond it. And that subtle shift is enough to weaken depth, without weakening belief. If I were standing where you are now, knowing what I know, I would not panic. Panic is unproductive. Panic keeps attention scattered. I would not throw away everything modern or retreat from life. That is reaction, not discernment. Reaction is easy to provoke. Discernment is difficult to cultivate. I would begin by reclaiming specific moments that are meant to be undisturbed. Not many, just intentional. Moments where nothing is tracked, measured, timed, or optimized. Moments where the only task is presence, not performance, not productivity, presence. That alone disrupts more influence than people realize. I would pay attention to how silence feels, not judge it. Observe it. If silence feels uncomfortable, restless, or empty, that is information. It means your interior environment has been conditioned for stimulation. Conditioning can be reversed, but only through gentle consistency, not force. Force creates resistance. Resistance reinforces vigilance. Vigilance sustains the problem. Stillness must be reintroduced slowly, like a language you once spoke fluently, but have not used in years. At first it feels awkward, then unfamiliar. Eventually, it feels like home again. From the perspective of someone who once helped design influence systems, I can tell you that the most dangerous moment for any system is when the participant becomes aware of how their attention is being guided. Awareness collapses automation. Automation is the lifeblood of large-scale influence. No one has time to micromanage individuals. Systems rely on habits. Habits rely on repetition. Repetition relies on unconscious acceptance. When you interrupt that chain, even briefly, the system weakens. That is why moments of intentional disconnection are so powerful, not as rebellion, but as recalibration. There's a reason the Dark Kingdom prefers noise over silence, speed over slowness, information over wisdom. Wisdom cannot be rushed. It emerges. It requires patience. It requires listening. Listening requires quiet. Quiet creates space. Space allows discernment. Discernment exposes patterns. Patterns reveal influence. Influence loses power when seen clearly. This sequence is why silence has always been targeted indirectly. It is too obvious to ban it, so it is crowded out instead, filled with content, filled with stimulation, filled with obligation, filled with self-improvement, until silence feels like absence rather than fullness. You may have noticed that many believers struggle to articulate what they hear in prayer now, not because God is silent, but because internal noise has increased. When too many signals compete, clarity suffers. This is not a moral failure. It is an environmental one. The solution is not trying harder. Effort amplifies noise. The solution is creating conditions where listening becomes possible again. Conditions where attention is not constantly split. Conditions where you are not observing yourself while attempting to surrender. One of the most telling indicators we used internally was recovery time. How long did it take for someone to feel settled after interruption? Years ago, recovery was quick. A moment of silence restored focus. Over time, recovery lengthened. People needed stimulation to relax. Silence became effortful. That reversal is significant. When rest requires stimulation, the system has succeeded. When stillness feels foreign, influence is already embedded. But the reversal can be reversed. That is the part rarely discussed. As someone who once stood on the other side, I can tell you that nothing frustrates influence strategies more than intentional simplicity. Not minimalism as a trend, but simplicity of attention. Choosing fewer inputs, fewer metrics, fewer interruptions, fewer simultaneous demands. The human soul was not designed for constant fragmentation. It adapts, but adaptation is not the same as health. Many people confuse the two. They assume because they can function, they are well. Functionality is not wholeness. Wholeness requires integration. Integration requires time, and stillness. You are not behind. You are not late. You are becoming aware. Awareness often arrives as discomfort because it disrupts what has become familiar. Familiar patterns feel safe even when they are draining. Letting go of them feels risky even when it is restorative. This is why discernment must be gentle. Harsh self-judgment only adds another layer of noise. The goal is not perfection. The goal is presence. Presence is enough to begin undoing years of subtle conditioning. The dark kingdom does not lose because people become angry or rebellious. It loses when people become attentive. Attentive to where their focus goes. Attentive to how silence feels. Attentive to when self-awareness competes with surrender. Attentive to the difference between managing a spiritual life and inhabiting one. That difference is everything. And once you sense it, you cannot unsee it. You will begin to notice how often your attention is pulled outward or inward at the expense of upward. You will notice how rare uninterrupted moments have become. And you will understand why reclaiming them is not optional but essential. What I am describing is not a dramatic overthrow. It is a quiet reclamation. Ground retaken not through force, but through clarity, through choosing when to be available and when not to be, through deciding that some moments are sacred enough to remain unmeasured, through remembering that not everything valuable can be tracked, optimized, or improved. Some things must be received. Presence is one of them. And when presence returns, depth follows naturally, not because you chased it, but because you made room for it. Stay attentive. The most important part of this conversation is not what you are hearing, but what you will begin to notice afterward. That noticing is where influence weakens and discernment grows. And once discernment grows, the entire strategy loses its grip, not with a fight, but with a quiet release. There is a reason this strategy ultimately fails, and it is the reason I am speaking with calm instead of urgency. Influence systems are powerful, but they are not sovereign. They depend on conditions remaining favorable. They depend on habits staying unconscious. They depend on people confusing movement with progress and noise with life. The moment a believer becomes still by choice, not by exhaustion, something breaks, not loudly, quietly. Predictability dissolves. Patterns blur. The environment no longer produces the same outcome. This is why, no matter how refined the strategy became, there was always a ceiling we could not break through. We could thin prayer, but we could not extinguish it. We could fragment attention, but we could not erase hunger. We could exhaust believers, but we could not replace what stillness restores. That limitation was always there, and it is still there now. Stillness is not passive. That is the great misunderstanding. Stillness is active resistance against fragmentation. When a believer chooses to enter silence without measuring, without timing, without monitoring, without optimizing, they step outside the system entirely. Systems cannot influence what they cannot observe. They cannot redirect what they cannot predict. They cannot fragment what is fully present. This is why stillness feels uncomfortable at first. You are withdrawing from a conditioned environment. The discomfort is not danger, it is withdrawal from noise. And like any withdrawal, it passes if you do not mistake it for harm. The dark kingdom thrives on urgency. Urgency keeps attention shallow. Urgency shortens reflection. Urgency favors reaction over discernment. When everything feels immediate, nothing can be examined deeply. That is why so much of modern life feels rushed, even when nothing urgent is actually happening. That feeling is not accidental. It keeps people moving without settling. But stillness collapses urgency. Silence stretches time. Presence slows perception. And when perception slows, discernment sharpens. Discernment is not dramatic, it is quiet clarity. It is the ability to sense when something is misaligned, even if it looks harmless. That ability cannot be taught through content alone. It emerges through practice. You may have noticed that some of the most grounded believers you know are not the most informed. They may not articulate complex theories, they may not track everything, they may not optimize their spiritual lives, but they carry a weight of presence that cannot be faked. That presence comes from familiarity with stillness. They are not rushed internally. They are not constantly scanning. They listen deeply, and because they listen deeply, they move deliberately. That kind of believer cannot be easily redirected because they are not driven by stimulation. They are guided by discernment. Discernment frustrates influence because it cannot be anticipated through data. One of the last internal assessments I participated in before stepping away concluded with an uncomfortable observation. The more systems we built to influence behavior, the more fragile they became. Complexity created vulnerability. Each added layer increased efficiency but reduced resilience. The entire structure depended on people remaining unaware of how their attention was being shaped. The moment awareness spread, even slowly, the effectiveness dropped. Not because people rebelled, but because they simplified. They chose fewer inputs. They reclaimed boundaries. They protected silence. That simplicity collapsed entire chains of influence that took years to build. This is why the response to awareness is often ridicule rather than debate. Debate invites examination. Ridicule shuts it down. Mockery discourages reflection. If people stop to think, the system weakens. If people dismiss without thinking, the system survives. That is why you may feel resistance when you share these ideas, not anger, dismissal, laughter, minimization. Those responses are not personal. They are conditioned. They protect familiarity. Familiarity feels safe even when it is draining. You do not need to convince anyone of anything. Convincing creates friction. Friction creates defensiveness. Defensiveness reinforces vigilance. Vigilance sustains fragmentation. Instead, live differently. Choose moments of intentional quiet. Let others notice the difference in your presence. Presence is persuasive without effort. A calm, attentive believer stands out in a fragmented world. That contrast raises questions naturally, and questions are far more powerful than arguments. The Dark Kingdom has always underestimated patience. It excels at speed. It excels at stimulation. It excels at distraction. But it does not understand waiting. Waiting without anxiety. Waiting without expectation. Waiting without monitoring. That kind of waiting cannot be exploited. It produces resilience that does not depend on circumstances. It restores clarity without effort. It renews strength without stimulation. That is why waiting has always been sacred. And that is why it has been crowded out, not forbidden. If there is one thing I want you to carry forward from this conversation, it is this. Nothing has gone wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not failing spiritually. You are responding normally to an environment designed to fragment attention. The solution is not more effort. It is less noise, less monitoring, less self-observation during moments meant for surrender. Give yourself permission to be unavailable, to be unreachable, to be unproductive, to be unmeasured. Those permissions feel radical in a culture obsessed with optimization, but they are ancient practices disguised as rebellion. I am not warning you of an approaching catastrophe. Fear clouds discernment. I am telling you that a line is being drawn quietly, not by darkness, but by awareness. Those who remain fragmented will continue to feel exhausted without understanding why. Those who reclaim stillness will feel grounded even when circumstances are difficult. The difference will not be dramatic at first. It will be subtle. A deeper sense of rest. A clearer sense of direction. A quieter confidence. Over time, that difference becomes unmistakable. The Dark Kingdom does not lose through confrontation. It loses through irrelevance. When believers no longer respond predictably to stimulation, urgency, or noise, influence loses its grip. When believers choose presence over performance, systems designed for management fail. When believers protect silence, discernment returns. And when discernment returns, manipulation becomes visible. Visibility is fatal to influence. You may feel a responsibility now, not a burden, but a weight. A sense that this understanding is not meant to be hoarded. That is natural. Awareness invites stewardship. Share carefully. Not everyone is ready to hear this. Some are still attached to familiarity. Some need time to feel the cost before they seek clarity. Do not force insight. Live it. Let your calm speak. Let your boundaries teach. Let your presence testify. If you want to remain ahead, not of darkness, but of distraction, stay attentive, not anxious. Attentive. Notice when noise creeps into spaces meant for silence. Notice when monitoring replaces listening. Notice when urgency crowds out waiting. These notices are not reasons for guilt. They are invitations to recalibrate. Each recalibration weakens patterns that rely on unconscious participation. The reason I speak now is simple. The strategy is becoming less subtle because subtlety has reached its limit. When influence grows obvious, it signals saturation. Saturation always precedes collapse. Systems overextend. Noise increases, fragmentation intensifies. That escalation creates the very discomfort that drives people toward stillness. And stillness undoes everything. Quietly, completely. Remain grounded. Remain present. Protect moments that cannot be interrupted. Refuse to measure what must be received. Choose silence without apology. In doing so, you step outside patterns that were never designed to withstand awareness. You do not need to fight. You do not need to fear. You only need to be fully here. And in that presence, the entire strategy loses its power not because you opposed it, but because you no longer participated in it.